All right, hi everybody, and welcome to Stream, powered by TruckTractorTrailer.com. It's your go-to podcast for everything trucking. I'm Chris Lorifus. I'm the Chief Business Officer over here at TruckTractorTrailer.com. And today's guest is Lewie Pugh. He's the Executive Vice President of the OOIDA, Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association. He is a veteran driver. He's actually getting on the road a little bit today after the podcast is done recording. He's an outspoken advocate for the industry, and he's also spent years debating this driver shortage myth and fighting for better conditions for drivers. So we're really looking forward to having him here today on Stream. If you haven't done so already, please make sure to click on that subscribe button at the bottom of your screen. We'd love to have you as a subscriber to our Stream podcast. In today's episode, we're going to dissect why drivers are quitting. Low pay, brutal conditions, and an industry that often prioritizes profit over people. The problem isn't necessarily just a shortage, it's really a reckoning. So Lewie, help us a little bit. There was a landline debate, an article that came out not too long ago about these claims of driver shortages. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, we at OOIDA have been saying for years that there is no driver shortage. This is a myth. That's something that's been spread around, and unfortunately, the people who spread around did a really good job of getting people convinced in it. I'll give them that much. And it's a shame, but what we have is a driver turnover problem, and we've had that for a long, long time. And unfortunately, the people who spread the myth and want that to be the big carriers and stuff, that's to keep wages low and drivers condition train the amount of training we get at a very minimum amount and stuff like that, because they can keep people believing that there's this need. So we got to hurry up and get these people driving trucks. And again, I go back to what I said, we have a turnover problem or shortage problem where we got people coming into this industry. There's 400,000 to 500,000 new CDL entrants every single solitary year. I mean, just think about that. 400,000 to 500,000 people get a CDL every year, brand new. They just come, they don't stay, and then they leave, because the same people that used to perpetuate the driver shortage myth or still perpetuate the driver myth, they used to also say they had an over 90% turnover rate. Well, they kind of quit using that number, because that, when you start thinking about 90%, well, where's all these people going? And can we imagine our businesses or industry where you lose over 90% of the people you work with every year? But that happens in trucking, and people leave, because they either find out they don't make the money they thought they'd make. They find out that it's very hard to have places to park because of the parking shortage. They find out, that there's enforcement and lots of people with their hands out taking their money. They're away from their home. The pay is very low. They give away 20, 30 hours a week waiting to be loaded or unloaded at shippers or receivers, and, kind of being treated like second-class citizens. And the list just goes on and on and on.
Yeah, so it sounds like, I think I agree with you that there's really been there's really a lot of myths out there in the industry with why drivers might be quitting, as well as that there's really not a shortage, right?
Right. I mean, that's the thing. There's no shortage. Plenty of people, these guys, some stay in trucking but get into different things like construction, stuff like that. Some people just do it with their CDLs altogether. But, you can't expect people to come in and make minimum wage or less, be gone 200 plus days a year from their house, wondering every night where they're going to park, sleep, wondering, because every night a trucker's left with, the choice of either they shut down early or they lose money because trucking's paid by piecework. B, they continue to drive and hope that when they run out of hours where they're at, there is a place to park. And if there is a safe place to park, if there isn't a safe place to park, then they're left with the choice of either park somewhere where it's unsafe or continue on down the road and risk being caught for being in violation of hours of service. Because, of course, truckers are, governed by the amount of hours that they can drive. And, so there's the first big thing. I mean, anybody needs a good night's sleep. The next thing is, of course, falls in under the pay. Because again, a trucker is piecework. So you only get paid by the mile. So you only get paid when you're driving. By most carriers. There's carriers that pay hourly and stuff, but mass majority over the road. And so, if you get stuck in traffic, you lose money. If you sit at a shipper or receiver half a day, not getting loaded, you lose money. So you have these things to contend with as well, and which makes it very frustrating, very hard for a trucker. And then, of course, there's no time and a half because truckers are exempt from time and a half. Average trucker works 70 to 80 hours a week, but only gets paid straight time even after 40. That isn't fair either. I mean, why shouldn't a trucker get time and a half? An employee driver, that is. I mean, and again, there's companies out there that pay it and do, but a lot who don't. We've heard a lot about this overtime tax break, where they're not going to tax overtime on workers. Well, truckers will be exempt from that because they're exempt from hours of service in the Fair Labor Standards Act. So, and that's all hinged on that. So that doesn't help truckers at all. And so there's those things right off the top.
Yeah, so it sounds like, truckers really, where there's been improvements, let's say, to conditions, truckers really haven't been able to take advantage of it. Where there's been improvements to wages, truckers really haven't been able to take advantage of it either. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, that's 100% correct. I mean, things are stagnant. If trucking salaries had kept up with inflation since the 1970s, truckers would all be making six figures. And I said, unfortunately, trucking wages have not kept up with inflation since the 1970s, ever since deregulation. And, what's happened is we've created this myth of a driver shortage to keep the wages low. I mean, right there's your first proof that there's not a shortage. Whenever you have a shortage of something, what's the first thing that happens? It costs more. It costs more to have it. Well, driving truck drivers don't cost more. So we don't have a shortage because people aren't, paying wages to get their money up there. You could say we maybe had a little bit of one during COVID, but even then, I think it's fair to argue we have a shortage of experienced drivers because guys and gals don't stay in the industry long enough to get the experience. Because I always have that. Always people say, well, I can't find any drivers. I say, well, do you hire experienced drivers or do you hire inexperienced drivers? And they said, well, we hire experienced drivers. I said, that's because the inexperienced ones aren't staying long enough to get the experience for you to hire.
How long do you think it takes for a CDL driver to get truly experienced, where you call them an experienced driver on the road?
Oh, I'd say, talk about setting me up. I'd say a couple years. I mean, a good year and a half to 2 years. It depends on where they go and what you consider experience. I know every trucker out there is going to have a different attitude on this and a different idea. But, I mean, that's part of the problem in our industry. You can take a kid from Florida, and I'm not picking on kids or Florida, but you can take a 21-year-old person out of Florida who's never left to Florida. He can go to a trucking school for about 6 weeks, maybe that long, 8 weeks, pay the money, get a CDL, and the next thing he can be in January rolling out of Florida, heading for somewhere Colorado, Wyoming, in snow and mountains. And he's never driven in snow, or maybe never even seen snow before in his life. And now he's driving an 21-year-old with an 18-wheeler weighing 80,000 pounds crossing the mountains. And maybe he's never seen a mountain because there ain't no mountains in Florida either, And unfortunately, that's the problem. The training, and that's another problem. The training and barrier of entry into our industry is just so low. It's just so low that, and it's not fair to the trucks, or the drivers, the motoring public, anybody. But, and that's another reason people leave, because they get into this industry, they get training that they think is going to teach them how to do it. And then when they get turned loose out there on the highway, they're like, oh my God, I don't know what I'm doing. And they don't have a comfort. If you don't feel comfortable in something, you usually don't stick with it. And that's another reason they leave.
So it sounds like just going to trucking school isn't enough. Do you think there should be some kind of additional required training over and above trucking school? Like, a lot of professions, you can go to school, but then you've got to have like an internship or some sort of cooperative where you really learn on the job and it complements your skills. What about for trucking? Is there a kind of a training plan you'd recommend just to get more experienced drivers on the road so that there's less accidents?
Yeah, we'd like to see either a graduated type licensing system like you work for, or an apprenticeship program. I mean, a lot of places have, especially in trades, you have apprenticeship. some sort of an apprenticeship program where you have to go out there and you can drive and you drive with experience. And the trainer that you're driving with or whoever you're working with, they need to be sitting in the passenger seat, not sleeping. Because that's another problem. Yeah, some of these carriers have gotten waivers where they can train people to drive from, while they're, while the trainer is actually in the sleeper, So anyway, how do you learn to drive a truck from a trainer when he's in a sleeper?
No, I hear that. I mean, I have to be. I don't see how you could possibly train anybody when you're not actually there with them, paying attention, right? So it sounds like that's another pretty big gap.
Yeah, I mean, there's fleets who got waivers for that because they got training and they got in the entry level driver training and they got a waiver that their trainer can be sleeping. And lots of them. If you hear a company like, there's a big fleet down here in southern Missouri, lease purchases, and they do training. And I was at an event with them, and they were talking about how they do all this training, and they send the trainee out for 50,000 miles before they turn him loose in the truck with a trainer. So I asked the question, are you training, like, is the trainer in the passenger seat? Or do you run this like a team operation and each driver's sleeping while the other's driving, the trainer and the student? And they're like, well, it's like a team operation, the trainer and the student sleep. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, wonder what he's learn. Well, wonder what we're all learning through osmosis here, So, but unfortunately, that's the reality. Today's reality, and has been for a long time, of how this stuff works. And it's unfortunate because we're just setting these people up to fail for failure.
Yeah, so it's sounding like a lot of the training quality of a lot of the drivers out there is pretty poor. And that's one of the reasons why they may get into a lot of accidents or have safety issues, right? And I'm thinking it's not necessarily just an issue with vehicle accidents on the road, but it could also be drivers are just more likely to hurt themselves because I think there's a lot more to driving a truck than just the driving, right? The loading and unloading, there's got to be training there as well. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I think you need to be trained to unload. You need to be trained how to get out of bad situations. Anybody can go out here and run around some cones. Or I shouldn't say anybody, but it's pretty easy to go out and drive around some cones. It's pretty easy to drive up and down the interstate, in rural areas and stuff like that, and keep the truck in the right lane and straight and all that stuff. Where it gets tricky is when you get yourself into maybe not by your own, but just into bad situations or into tight situations. Whether you're in areas you don't know, you're going down mountains with heavy loads, you make a wrong turn and end up on a street you don't want to be on, you end up coming up to a low bridge. There's all kinds of things that happen out there on an everyday, daily basis that you need to be trained. I mean, I was in the military, I was in the Army, and you train to fight, you train to win. But I'll spend a lot of time training on when things go sideways, because, and I'm not saying comparing trucking to combat, but at the end of the day, lots of things go sideways. Nothing in combat you can really completely predict. And it's the same thing in trucking to a point, because you're out there, it's you and one truck in your truck, and that's all you have control over. You have cars cutting you off. You have people give you the wrong directions. You end up on the wrong directions. So many different things. Weather, all these things happen that you have no control over. So, again, it's good. You need to be trained on what to do when things go sideways. I mean, thank God I grew up in an era where they taught defensive driving. I think my 2.5 miles of safe driving, I give a lot of credit just being taught defensive driving skills, both from my family, but then going through driver's ed and when I was in the military and all that stuff. Always be looking for an out, always be thinking, I tell people, when you're driving down the road and you see a car and you think, what's the dumbest thing that car can do? And then you can be disappointed or relieved when they don't. But most of the time, you're not going to be surprised because that's what they're going to do.
And it sounds like I heard some of the Smith training keys in there, I think. Always leave yourself an out.
Yeah, exactly. That's like defensive driving 101 stuff. And, pay attention to your surroundings. So, that's what you have to do. And that's what you have to, if you're not trained. And, I feel like, for one, there's a lot more congestion, a lot more traffic. But it just seems like ever since COVID is ending, people have gotten so worse on the road They drive crazy. I mean, I'm in Missouri, and I used to from Ohio. I used to truck back and forth to New York City, New Jersey, and it's nothing against the people on the East Coast. I loved going out there personally, but they were always in a hurry, always trying to get somewhere, and weren't always the kindness on the highway, maybe. But like the whole damn country's like that now. And I mean, again, don't bother me, but it's just like everywhere. I drive the interstate for about 10 miles in the morning coming to work every morning. And it's just crazy to me, the shit I see people doing.
I guess I've noticed that as well. Now I live on the East Coast, right? I live near Philadelphia. So I guess, maybe we're used to more congested roadways than say you are in parts of Missouri. But I've noticed that too. And I think being in the industry, I make it a point sometimes to slow down and let a truck in versus trying to speed up and, cut them off, let's say before that merge or something like that. Do you think needs to be some better awareness nationally about just how private vehicle motorists can get along a little better with trucking? Do you think that would be helpful?
Yeah, but 100%. I think training needs to be done to not only for truckers, but we need to be training kids how to drive cars. And it's crazy to me, just like here in the state of Missouri, they don't even fund driver's ed anymore. They don't have the money to fund driver's ed. So what you're hoping is this 16-year-old kid who don't know nothing, because none of us did when we were 16, although we thought we knew everything. But you have a 16-year-old kid here who don't know nothing. You got to hope and pray that his parents know something about driving. And probably some do, probably a lot do not. And and what that's going to create is just a complete snowball to the bottom, in my opinion. I took driver's ed. Grew up on a farm. I was driving a truck and pickup truck and tractors and all that shit way before I had a driver's license. But I still had driver's ed, and it was different going out with my driver's ed teacher than it was being by my parents. So my parents were strict, but it's still different. And, it's probably a good idea to have people that are professionally trained to train people kids how to drive cars. And when you're training kids how to drive cars, they need to be taught how to handle and drive around trucks, and so do adults. And because we don't have that, this whole common courtesy thing, I mean, it's not lost on the highway. It's everywhere you go, in my opinion. People don't hold the door. You hold the door for somebody, they act shocked nowadays. But it's just the way, and it's sad we've gotten that way, and we need to get back. Yeah. Courtesy. But again, you're right. But I don't think people know to not cut off trucks. People cut off cars, and it's just everybody's in a hurry. They're messing with their phones. I mean, I believe there's too much crap on cars nowadays. I mean, I'm jokingly say they ain't made a good car since they took the dimmer switch off the floor. But with that being said, I don't have any cars that have this stuff. I got a pickup truck and a base model with that and a little Ford car for work. But like I get rental cars a lot. And they got all these damn computer screens. And our semi has it too, like an iPad thing on the dash. And you got to run your heat and all this stuff and try to work all that stuff. It seemed to me it was a lot safer, a lot simpler when we just had little knobs and switches, because your motor memory would learn where those were and you wouldn't even have to look anymore. You just reach down and hit them. And I think people are spending too much time. So when you put phones and all this different stuff, there's too much stuff to mess with. We're not paying attention to what we should be paying attention. That's driving.
No, I think you're right about that. I mean, I feel that way myself, having a relatively new car. It's about 2 years old. And it's got all these safety features on it, but I don't think I feel any safer on the road. And if I could just count all the people that I drove by that they have a phone in their hand, and then you look at what happens if that's done in trucking and the consequences, I mean, it's bad, whether it's a passenger car or whether it's a truck, but a tractor trailer driving down the road, I think, can be a heck of a lot worse if there's distractions.
100%. And trucks have all this latest and greatest stuff too. And some of it works, some of it doesn't. A lot of it, because trucks are so much different than passenger cars, and they're trying to legislate to put some of this stuff on, make it all forced, and it's not ready. I mean, we would support this stuff as an organization if we thought it was ready, and so would most truckers. I mean, what trucker doesn't want something to be safer? But some of this stuff, it seems like it's a hindrance. And again, unfortunately, the problem with the cell phones, even if a trucker ain't on the cell phone, the person driving around them is and runs into them or something like that. And which happens a lot because, well over 75% of the accidents out there involving a car and a truck are unfortunately caused by the car, not the truck, which gets very frustrating to truckers. And it's another reason people leave, because over 75% of the accidents are caused by the car and not the truck. Who's the real problem?
Right.
But
No, I think you're right. I think we're missing a big opportunity there. This isn't just about truck safety. This is about overall driver safety, going back to your point about driver's ed.
Right.
I can remember driving around for 3 hours at a time in the old driver's ed car with the instructor, and that was good stuff. I mean, that really taught me, and there's still things that I remember. I can hear my old driver's ed teacher, Mr. McMullen, talking about that. Leaving enough following distance in front to always assume the other driver's going to do the wrong thing. That's just the basis of defensive driving. And I think probably a reason I've never had an accident. Knock on wood, of course.
Yes, that's good. But you're right. And now, and I think the problem is we're getting all these cars with all these safety features, which if you're paying attention to the road will probably really, really help you. I think the problem is people get a false sense of security, or they're younger and they've never driven a car without this stuff. So they just think it's, what we see on TV, it's Knight Rider from back when we were kids. It does everything, and unfortunately, these things are there to assist you, not take place of you. And that's what's getting lost. And I laugh, you talk about your driver's ed teacher. Mine was Mr. Beatty. And Mr. Beatty, he'd take 3 or 4, we'd have 3 or 4 kids in the car. And, like if somebody ran a stop sign, he'd make you get out and apologize to the stop sign.
Well, yeah, I don't remember having to do that, but man, I guess that was effective though, right? And it really makes you think.
I didn't have to apologize to any stop sign, but some of the other kids I was with did. And, and of course, we all made fun of each other, and it was a little probably embarrassing. But again, it was all in good fun. We all knew each other. But yeah, so.
I did have a friend tell me that the stop signs that had the white around the edge of them were optional.
Really?
Oh, yeah. That did. I was pretty gullible as a kid, but I'll tell you what, that only lasted about 5 minutes. You had talked a little bit earlier about why drivers are quitting, and you mentioned things like wages and parking, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit. You mentioned a lot of drivers out there, they're not even making minimum wage. And I guess my first question is, so what are you looking at for minimum wage? Because it's obviously different in some different states. And then how is that possible when you look at the amount of skill and how important that job is to the country to move goods around?
Well, again, trucking isn't governed by it's exempt in the Fair Labor Standards Act on overtime and stuff. And the thing is most guys get paid by piecework, and their time, like when they're sitting around loading docks and stuff, they're not driving, so they're not getting paid. I use the example. There's a McDonald's across the street from my office here in Missouri, pays starting salary according to their billboard is $15 an hour. Average pay of a trucker is starting out like $50,000, I think they say. If you take that, but you see what people miss is that's not 40 hours a week. That's 70 hours, 80 hours a week. When you divide that out, that's less than $15 an hour for a year. If you break that down. So that's the problem. And some guys probably making, if the average is 50, there's some people out there making 35 or 40. There's some making 65 or 70, of course. But if the average is 50, you got some down here and you got some up here. So, and unfortunately, it's just the way it's been. Truckers have been getting their wages fleeced, like I said, since deregulation. And unfortunately, I hate to say it, but us as truckers probably are the biggest ones to blame because we let it happen and we work. We have a bill in Congress right now to restore take away the overtime exemption from the Fair Labor Standard Act. And we have that bill in Congress right now. And it's funny to me how many truckers are pushing back and complaining about it, and drivers. And it's like, I don't think they completely understand it. And they're like, well, companies will just pay us less. No, they're going to have to pay you for all your time. That's what we're trying to get here. But there's truckers who push back and get all upset because I don't know why, I don't know why they don't understand, but whether they don't understand what, but they're just scared to death. And, if you're a good, safe trucker, there's good, safe jobs out there. You just have to, find it, be patient, whatever. But yeah, it's funny. The Got Trucker Act is what's called guaranteed overtime. And truckers are listening to this, and people should be calling their lawmakers. I mean, to me, you want to make the highways safer. They got all these stupid things like speed limiters and all this other crap that they're trying to pass in the name of highway safety. The first way to make people safer is pay them better. If you look at the carriers out here, drivers are paid what they should be and paid, like the Walmarts of the world or the UPSs of the world and some of these LTL companies, ABF, stuff like that. Their safety records are impeccable, but they pay their people. They pay them for everything. They don't put up with bull crap, but they pay the people. They pay them for everything they do. I mean,
so treat people well, and you see benefits from that, right?
Yeah, you're worried about drivers get paid by the mile. You're worried about them speeding, which, instead of putting a speed limiter on their truck, pay them by the hour, pay them by the hour, not by the mile. Then that is what it is, And the thing is, the big problem's always been in years past. Well, we don't have any way to keep track of what these drivers are doing. Are they out here driving? Or are they hanging out at the truck stop flirting with Millie the waitress or, sleeping? What are they doing? Well, you do now because they all have these logging devices that big carriers wanted. They were supposed to make the highways so much safer, which they didn't do, went the other way. But with that means, and that's a whole nother argument for another day. But at the end of the day, with those in the truck, you know where your drivers are doing, you know where they are, you know how much time they're spending at a place, so pay them.
Well, I think that's great insight. And, it sounds like that legislation in Congress could make a real big impact on safety, turnover, all those things we've talked about so far. But, one thing you hit on a couple of times, and you're not the only one I've heard it from, is truck parking. And in the past, let's say a year ago, I wouldn't have thought that truck parking was that big of a deal. But I hear about it a lot now. You mentioned it already twice in the past few minutes. Can you go a little deeper on that? Like what some of the issues are with truck parking and why that might influence turnover and safety and all those things?
Yeah, well, right now we have one safe spot technically for every 11 trucks on the highway. So, think about that. That's one safe place for everybody, one person, for every 11 trucks to park. And you're from Philadelphia, East Coast. It's terrible places for parking.
Oh, yeah.
So, anyway, but with that being said, this parking thing has been a problem for years. It just progressively gets worse between truck stops closing down, rest areas closing down, real estate's worth more for a shopping mall than it is a truck stop or whatever, just for what, then you have the NIMBYs of the world who don't want trucks and they want their shit, but they don't want trucks. Yeah. So you can't park there. So anyway, so with that all being said, that's sort of where we've gotten to this chronic problem of parking. Has for the last few years had a bill in Congress, the Truck Parking Safety Improvement Act, which would give locked money to pay for parking projects. See, that's the other problem. Parking projects come out of the Highway Trust Fund and government stuff like that to pay for it. Well, they're going to build bridges and roads before they're going to build parking. Because as I say, parking isn't sexy. There's nothing sexy about truck parking. No lawmaker's all excited to run out there and cut a ribbon for a truck parking lot. But buddy, he'll cut one for a bridge or something like that, And bridges and infrastructure is important. I'm not taking it, but what a lot other money gets spent is bicycle trails, highway beautification projects, a lot of little piddly crap like that. That comes out of the Highway Trust Fund too. Some places, so instead of, maybe we should be putting money into truck parking instead of beautification of the highway first, or a bicycle path. Nothing against the bicyclists, but it's probably a little bit safer for everybody if truckers have a safe place to park. So, of course, truckers, and the importance of this is, of course, one, there's nothing more important than a good night's rest, to be safe the next day. But truckers are governed by hours of service. They have to take a 10-hour break every day. They need a safe place to do that. And so it's like I said earlier, you're left with the choice almost daily Do I quit driving early and lose money? Do I drive to my 10 hours and hope I find a safe place to park? Or do I park in an unsafe place? Or do I just continue on and be in violation of our service and risk getting a ticket? And so, a violation. We saw, it's been a year and a half or so ago now, I think maybe 2 years, in Illinois, where a Greyhound bus hit a semi that was parked illegally on a ramp at a rest area one night. Killed a whole bunch of people in the bus, killed a bus driver, I think. Anyway, a trucker was parked there because they had nowhere else to go. He ran out of hours. There was nowhere at the truck stop, so he pulled off on that ramp. And unfortunately, the Greyhound bus driver went off the side of the road and hit the truck, illegally parked. And we're going to have more of that if we don't do something. I'm really, thank God we haven't had more already. But, if you take a road trip anywhere in America, especially after about 8 o'clock at night and start looking at the rest areas and exit ramps, you'll see trucks sitting everywhere. And it's because they don't have anywhere else to go. You can't just park a truck, at some little gas station or something like that. They need a big area and a lot of area. So that's the problem.
And I've seen some of that too. I kind of scratch my head and sort of wonder, a lot of these roads where you've got to pay a toll in order to drive on them, yet some of the rest areas are still closed. And I just think to myself, well, why? My tolls haven't gone down. I think motorists, well, look, even if you're in your private vehicle, you could get in an accident with a truck if you're driving drowsy, just like a truck can get in an accident with a private vehicle. So why wouldn't you want more of those rest stops if we're having such an issue with highway safety? And at least the rest stops are there. We got to at least open the ones that still exist, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, of course, it takes maintenance money and all this other stuff to keep these things up and going, but it should be a priority. It definitely should be a priority for people. We need to, like I said, parking isn't sexy. That stuff isn't sexy, so lawmakers don't care so much about it. But they and instead of addressing real problems like this, we continue to try to band-aid problems with the latest, greatest gadgets and all this other kind of stuff and regulation. These are things that we need to, we need to pay people. We need to let people get good, safe rest. These are things we need to train people better. These three things would make our highways and our roads so much safer if we just had to do them. But they're hard and they're expensive, and nobody wants to do hard, expensive things anymore. Like I said, we got to get that will back in DC for those kind of things to happen. But and then like you said, toll roads, that's a whole nother freaking disaster and unfair thing to the motoring public. But yeah. You're right.
That sounds like another podcast, actually.
Yeah,
we could probably spend a lot of time on that, huh? I think you get a lot of people to jump on board and express some of their frustration they got with toll roads.
Yeah, well, I drove the East Coast, like I said, most of my career, and from Ohio, Philly, D.C., Baltimore, New York City, New Jersey, and I spent about $11,000 a year on tolls. So yeah, no fan of tolls at all. So,
well, to kind of come back to. We initially started talking about, whether there's really a driver shortage, and you're saying, look, no, really, we don't have a driver shortage. We have a retention problem. Too many people cycling through the industry and not staying. We talked about, it sounds like three things, right? Pay them better, make sure they get a good night's rest, and make sure that they get the proper training. So what do you think you'd tell folks if you just had to say, well, to solve those three issues? It sounds like you've got some legislation pending. What are the you'd send to Washington or to the industry or to people that are saying, oh, there's a driver shortage, that would help fix all those problems? We've touched on them a little bit, but maybe if we just tried to sum that up, what are the best fixes we could enact right now?
Well, first of all, we don't say there's a driver shortage. We say there's a driver turnover problem. And we say the way we get the problem's been for far too long, Washington, D.C. You have said there's a driver shortage and you've regulated and legislated from that angle. And that's not the truth. The truth is we have a turnover problem and we need people to stay in our industry, because the longer they stay, the more experienced and the more skilled and the better they get and the safer the highways will be. So the first thing you need to do is train them and raise the barrier of entry. Not everybody can do this job. It's not anybody can do. We need to start thinking about truckers like we do electricians and plumbers and all these other trades, because we want to rush them through school, and it's so expensive and all this stuff. Nobody talks about how expensive it is to be an electrician. Nobody talks about how expensive it is to be a plumber or any of these other skilled jobs, or it takes 2 years to do it. Nobody's complaining about that. You know why? Because then you get to the second stage. Pay them. We pay electricians well. We pay plumbers well. We pay people with a certain skill well to do their job, as we should. Truckers have a certain skill too. They should get paid well. They're not home. They should get paid. I mean, at least the plumber gets to go home at night, most of them. And truckers in the other way. Majority of truckers don't get to go home. So they should get paid well. So we need to train them. We need to pay them. And then we need to be making sure we're taking care of the things they need when they're out there on the road, like the truck parking. It's very simple. Congress has had, for 2 of these, they've had the bills. We got Trucker Act for the overtime, and the second bill is the Truck Parking Safety Act. We need to set aside funds to pay for parking. The government dumps millions and millions into enforcement. And I'm not saying we don't need enforcement. But you know what the enforcement does? They write a ticket to that trucker who went 15 minutes over his hours because he couldn't find a place to park. Maybe we should be spending more money on parking, take some of the money from enforcement or from somewhere, so we're at least spending the same amount to make sure that driver has a safe place to park, so he doesn't get that violation or doesn't need that violation. And that enforcement officer could be doing something more constructive, as far as pulling people over for aggressive driving or speeding or cell phones or whatever, than worrying about this trucker who's 15 minutes over because he didn't have nowhere to park.
Well, and I think too, we're not really looking at the cost of this from the vantage point of when there's an accident, when people leave the industry, what the cost is of that kind of turnover and those kinds of catastrophes. I think if you added that into the equation, you'd probably see that it's money well spent, right? I think people look at this too much as it's a cost, not, it's an investment that'll pay off.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. Most of this stuff's that's the thing. Like the ELD I said that they passed a few years ago, it's done nothing to say. That was a huge expense to the trucker, huge expense. One of the most burdensome regulations ever. But they did it because it's going to save all these lives. Well, I guess at the time it's like 5 lives. I don't know. It didn't save any lives. Accidents have went the other way. Truckers feel more stressed. Truckers drive faster in construction zones and in 2-lane roads and stuff like that because they feel like they're playing beat the clock. So you're just, and then you put a speed limit on a truck, which just makes it that much even worse. So yeah, what we need needs to do is start listening to truckers. They're real good at listening to safety advocates and cops, and I got nothing against those people. They all got their thing and they all have their place, and they all have their experts. But who cares more about safety on the highway than anybody out there? And that's truckers, because that's where you live. That's where your office is. I'm getting ready here now. Go get in a semi and drive for the next 8 hours. The last thing in this world I want to do is have an accident. And that's what any trucker. Nobody wakes up in the morning and thinking, I want to go run over a car today or roll. Nobody. And God forbid they're called accidents for a reason. But we need to be using common sense and intelligence to come up with ways to fix things. And what we've been doing for the last 15 years ain't working. It's going the wrong direction. And we continue to not listen to the people who make their living behind the road, the experienced trucker. We listen little, but we don't act. And that's the thing they need to start doing. Listen to people who do the job.
So people that are listening to this podcast, then, who should they reach out to? Who should they call to get their voice heard a little better?
They should call their lawmaker. I will give a plug. If you are interested in more information on this stuff, or how to get a hold of your lawmaker, or even it's kind of a pre-made message for your lawmaker, you can go to fightingfortruckers.com. That's OOIDA's advocacy page. We have all legislation we're working on. I mean, this is a great time because we're going into a new highway bill. That's where most trucking regulations live or die. So there's going to be a lot of stuff coming out the next year or so. So, the more you can message your lawmakers for parking and pay and these kind of things, the greater chance we have to see some of this stuff getting across the finish line next year. But again, it's fightingfortruckers.com. You can look your lawmaker up on there. You can see who they are. You can read about the legislation. There's also a place you can message your lawmaker, and you can type in your own little message. You can change the message that we have typed in there, whatever. It's really cool. Once you've put your information in there the first time, it saves it so you can go back and message again. And as I tell people, you can send a message to a lawmaker who might do something faster than you can post something bitching about it on social media where it ain't going to do nothing.
So it sounds like there's a few pieces of pending legislation in front of Congress, and the time really is now. If they do it 6 weeks from now, the window may have closed.
Maybe the time is now. The more people that call, Congress, I mean, we got the best government money can buy, I jokingly say. We know there's a lot of stuff for all the money, but at the end of the day, grassroots will trump money any day, because the one thing a lawmaker doesn't want to do is lose their job. And if phones start ringing, then they start paying attention. I was on Capitol Hill a year ago when they were threatening to do away with TikTok and make it illegal. It was insane. You'd go in the lawmaker's office and the phone's ringing for people, and all the poor staffers, they were so drained all about TikTok. And I thought to myself then, this is how goofed up we've gotten as a country. We let all this stuff happen and nobody calls their lawmakers. But buddy, if you're going to take my social media, I'm going to shut the phones down on Capitol Hill. And that's just what they were doing. It was crazy. And
so we got to make the phones ring for truckers.
Phones ring for truckers
on Capitol Hill.
On Capitol Hill, whatever. That's how we make it. Yep, 100%.
All right. So Lewie, if I'm hearing you right, we got to train truckers the right way. We got to raise the barrier to entry in the industry. We've got to pay them right. That could include overtime. And we got to just take care of them on the road every day. This is their home. They got to be able to do their jobs and have a good quality of life like everybody else does.
You're correct. I mean, that's the start.
So, it's no joke to spend some time with you today, and you can really hear how you are one of the fiercest advocates for trucking and for the industry. So, Lewie, it's, again, real pleasure being able to have you on our TTT Stream podcast.
It's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed it, and thanks for having us. And we'll come back anytime. We're never afraid to talk about the issues.
All right. And if I could ask folks that are listening, please subscribe to TTT Stream. You can see this episode and many others. Truck Tractor Trailer is your community in the trucking industry where you can go to for all sorts of information. Lewie Pugh from OOIDA, good luck. Good luck on the 8 hours up to Wisconsin today in your semi, and we hope to see you back again.
Hey, thanks. It'll be fun. I don't get to drive much anymore, so it's kind of a play day, I guess, for me. And I just want to say thanks to all the truckers out there and the drivers. If you're not a member at OOIDA, call in, join now. If you call in and say you watch this podcast, we'll give you a $10 discount on your annual membership to from 45 to 35. So please call in and join. And please also check out Fighting for Truckers.
That sounds great. We'll put those links in the comments below. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in today. This has been TTT Stream. Have a great rest of your day.